Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and what we're going to discuss in this section is flowery sex rooms, natural husbands, blood money, and mistaken accounts of incest. We're going to talk about case studies in kinship structures as expressed in several different human societies. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head. We're going to talk about those people on the left because we are going to discuss kinship. Now, to recount very quickly. Kinship is, of course, the relationship between persons either through marriage or by blood. It is used by all human societies as a central organizing structure to order themselves. Kinship is how we determine loyalties. It's how we frame social relations. It's how we claim descent. It's how we determine inheritance. Now, what we're going to do next is examine two case studies in kinship structure. And as we walk through these structures, I want you to keep the following questions in your brain, cogitating on these questions as we describe these structures from, Southeast Asia, from China, and from the Middle East. And the questions I want you to put in your notes and cogitate about in your brains are: what is the lineality of these groups? What is the locality of these groups? And how do the kinship structures kind of function for these human societies? And the first group of people we're going to talk about are the Musu people of southern China. There they are, right up above my head. Now, the Musu people of China inhabit the mountainous regions of the eastern Himalayas, they're actually the northern neighbors to the Kachin people we talked about earlier, who are like on the other side of the border in Burma. There's not a lot of Musu people. They number only about 40 to 60,000 individuals. They speak a very distinct language called Naxi, which is another one of these sort of Tibeto-Burman languages that you find up in the mountains of the eastern Himalayas. If you look at the map on the left, they're inhabiting kind of the eastern part of that area, the area that's in light blue. Now, in there in the upper left, that is a Musu village. Musu villages consist of a close collection of very large houses. They're not built out of adobe brick, they're built out of wood. But these sort of big houses, kind of piled one on top of the other, should remind you of something we looked at in the last lecture. And inside each of these big houses lives a large extended family. And now around this village, you have small-scale farming around the big house, but most of a family's wealth is tied up in pastoralism because most of the Musu occupy their time with herding. They're taking care of these big herds of cattle, buffalo, sheep, goats, but mostly ponies. They have these big herds of ponies. Now, the thing is that the Musu live in a part of China that is known for its very poor mountain soils. So in other words, you can't just sort of intensively, move your ponies onto a single patch of land because they'll eat all the grass and reduce it to desert. So basically, keeping your herds healthy requires a practice of something called transhumance, which is the constant movement of herds from mountains to valleys and then back to mountains again. So you have to constantly move these herds of buffalo or cattle or ponies to keep them from depleting the grass in any given region. So again, kind of picture in your mind a flat a plain with kind of rocky mountains and a dot in the middle, and that dot in the middle is going to be the big Musu village. But this is where most of the men will spend their time. The Musu men spend very little time in their actual homes. Most of the time they spend taking care of the herds, moving the herds of ponies, those are ponies right up above me, moving the herds of ponies or cattle or sheep from one mountain valley to another, from a high mountain plain to a river valley, just kind of constantly moving these herds. If in your mind you're kind of visualing this kind of rumpled terrain of these mountains with a dot in the middle, the herds are constantly kind of orbiting the big village, and the men are moving back and forth from the herd to the village, from the village to the herd. In fact, a single village might have like half a dozen herds. So the men are going to be rotating constantly between the different herds. And the men won't leave it all at once. What they'll have like 20 or so men taking care of the herd. And every time a new guy shows up, another guy can go home. So they're constantly rotating who is actually taking care of any herd at any given moment. And here's another odd, sort of twist, that because these guys really know the mountain passes of the southern Himalayas and the southern border with Burma and with Vietnam, the Musu have gotten a reputation as these like really wily smugglers. If you want to move like illicit goods or like people in and across the border of southern China, you pay the Musu and they will sneak you across the Chinese border. At least so I have read. I don't want to get them in trouble or anything. But that's what the men do. They smuggle, reportedly, across the Chinese border. They take care of their herds of ponies, and they're basically moving back and forth between village and herd, between herd and village. But most of their time is spent with the herd. This leaves in the village a core group of women. Hence, the big houses and the small fields around them, these little sort of garden plots around the big villages, are mostly tended to by a core group of Musu women, which is basically going to be a matriarch, her sisters, their daughters, and their children. The big houses are owned by the women and are passed from mother to daughter. Each big house has a head of the household, which is generally the oldest woman present, who is the matriarch. And she owns the house. She's going to pass it to her eldest daughter. And the men just come and go. But they play no real significant role in running the house or even owning the house. And this is what one of those Musu big houses look like. It's, as you can see, it's this large, attractive, multi-storied structure. And there is a chief male, but the lead male is made, his status comes from his sister, which is to say the brother of this head matriarch is often the lead male. And in fact, the Musu have this odd tradition called Zuhun, and I'm probably mispronounced that. That's called the walking marriage, in which the husband will not actually move into the house of his wife at all. Now, generally the custom is that the husband moves into the house of his wife, but not all Musu men adhere to that practice, because the Musu men spend so much time with their herds of sheep or cattle or ponies. They could like rarely be at home. And you have a lot of men that will have not an actual marriage, but will tend to have a walking marriage. He will marry the girl next door in the big house next door. But when he comes to the village, he might actually keep his old room with his parents' house and just occasionally visit his wife. That's the Zuhun, that's the walking marriage, in which the husband does not move into the household of his wife at all. He only occasionally visits to enjoy her company, to hang out, and to enjoy her sexual favors. And indeed, many of these Musu houses have special rooms. They have a special room or a special suite of rooms that are basically these special sex rooms that are set aside for these walking marriages. They're called the flower room, in which a bride, and there's a Musu bride right above me, waiting for her husband to come back from his time with the cattle. And instead of her going into the room that she shares with her sisters, she's going to take her husband and they're going to spend a couple days in the sex room doing marital things. Because his children are actually not going to be raised by their biological father, but the main sort of paternal figure in children's life is actually their MB. Each man in turn raises the children of his sisters. Children take the name of the extended family, which is generally belongs to the family of the mother. Children inherit the family name of their mother, not their father, and their mother's brother. So I want you to think about the Musu for a second. What is the lineality of the Musu? Is it matrilineal? Is it patrilineal? Is it something else? What is the locality of the Musu? Is it patrilocal? Is it matrilocal? Is it neolocal? And can you, at least partially, explain the Musu traditions, how the Musu kinship structure functions for the Musu people? Now, we're going to move on to our second case study, the Bedouin of the Middle East. And as we move through the Bedouin, keep those same questions in the back of your head. What is their lineality? What is their locality? And how does the kinship structure function for the Bedouin people? Now, the Bedouin themselves are desert-dwelling nomads of the Middle East and North Africa. And if you look at the map right up above my yellow box, they're in sort of the shaded green. These are all the Bedouin areas. And those are Bedouin right there. They're known for their adherence to Orthodox Islam, but I want to make a distinction here. Traditional Orthodox Islam is very, very different from sort of the fundamentalist Islam that sort of makes the news and like blows people up. The Bedouin generally speak Arabic. They're divided into about 50 or so kind of large nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes. Now, the original Bedouin homeland was in Saudi Arabia. It was in the interior of Saudi Arabia. And the Bedouin themselves are considered to be kind of these idealized, they kind of live these idealized Arabic lives. They're seen as being the original Arabs. And there's something in Middle Eastern culture, the Bedouin are kind of held up to be to live these very idealized lives, very, very humble lives in the desert. The Bedouin themselves make a living off pastoralism, much like the Musu. They make a living moving large herds of sheep, goats, and cattle from water source to water source to water source across the deserts of the region. There they are, moving camels across the desert from one water source to the next. They have no permanent home. Now, traditionally in the medieval past, this movement, this nomadism, was supplemented by trade, because they would not only move their cattle from one water source to another, but each water source generally had its own town or small city, and the Bedouin would basically move goods between these cities, because, I mean, they're moving anyway. And in fact, in sort of the deserts of the Middle East, often the nomadic Bedouin were one of the more reliable ties that connected all of these far-flung cities and towns across the deserts together. Traditionally, each nomadic group consisted of a single large extended family headed by a central man and his sons, each of these groups being about 80 to 120 individuals, and that number should sound awfully familiar. Now, the herds and all of the tents and everything is collectively owned by the family. The women tend to tend the children, they tend to take care of the tents, they tend to make these large communal meals, while the men are primarily focused on taking care of the group, scouting ahead to the next water source, and taking care of the animals. The head man of each Bedouin group, there he is, there's the head man of a man around 1920. The head man of each Bedouin group generally takes several wives and is expected to. If you are a high status man who is quite wealthy, Bedouin culture expects you to be polygamous, to take 3 or 4 or even 5 wives. Take as many wives as you could afford. Until the mid-20th century, the Bedouin were also exceptionally warlike, often raiding other Bedouin groups or raiding the cities and towns of the Middle East when they would move from town to town to town, from water source to water source to water source. And before they traded with these towns, they would kind of, scope out, can we trade with these people or can we just take what we want? And the goals of such raids tended to be goods, it tended to be cattle, and it also tended to be women. In fact, in the First World War, the Great Arab Revolt of 1916-1918, led by the Bedouin and their Hashemite princes, proved instrumental in the Allied victory in the Middle East, in the defeat of the Germans and the Ottoman Turks back in 1918. The Arab Revolt was a major component of that victory. Now, different Bedouin groups will exchange women in arranged marriages, in highly formalized exchanges. There's a pair of Bedouin brides right up above my head. And indeed, the straight up purchase of women is not unknown, where one Bedouin group will meet another. Bedouin group A needs a wife for a boy. They'll see Bedouin group B needs money and has an available daughter. They'll straight up buy her. Women will retain their family name after marriage, but their children always take the family name of their father and their grandfather. Hence, all of the men in a single Bedouin group will share the same family name, but almost none of the women will. Now, the traditional pattern for women is to marry within their own Bedouin group. Indeed, women are said to have a natural husband, and any woman's natural husband is her FBS, her father's brother's son. Indeed, if a woman marries anyone who isn't her FBS, she needs the permission of both her father and her FBS to actually marry this individual. Divorce is permitted as long as all important male relatives are in agreement. If a woman commits adultery outside of marriage, she is expected to be killed. And this is the honor killing tradition. And the tradition of honor killing of adulterous women is not uncommon. And it's usually either the father or the oldest brother who has the responsibility of sort of executing the adulterous woman. And because her adultery is bringing shame on the entire group and lowering their status among all of the Bedouin, among these big Bedouin tribes. Adulterous men are rarely disciplined. Indeed, it is having sex with lots of women increases your status within Arabic society. So the women marry into the group and the children take the name of their father and grandfather. What is the lineality of the Bedouin Arabs? What is the locality of the Bedouin Arabs? And can you use the information I've given you about their herding and nomadic practices to explain how the kinship structure functions for the Bedouin people of the Middle East, sitting down to a very big meal, as you can see on the left? The Bedouin, traditionally, the Bedouin have a reputation for really good food, really, really good food. Now, one of the things that anthropologists noted was that there seems to be a set number of kinship terms that exist from culture to culture to culture. Indeed, there seems to be only about 6 ways in which humans organize their kinship terminology. The words in which what you actually call your relatives, because what you call father in one culture is not necessarily the same as what you would call it in another culture. We've already seen this with the Trobriand Islanders. Now, anthropologists kind of organized these 6 options and gave them names. And the names are the Sudanese, the Crow, the Omaha, the Iroquois, the Eskimo, and the Hawaiian kinship terminological systems. Now, of this, we're only going to deal with 3 of them, which is the last 3, the Iroquois, the Eskimo, and the Hawaiian, because these are by far the most common kinship term systems that you find. They account for something like 70 to 80% of all known human societies are either use an Eskimo, Iroquois, or Hawaiian kinship term system. We're going to start with one that should sound quite familiar, the Eskimo system. There's the Eskimo right up above me. They are modernly known as the Inuit, although I don't know if they're going to change the name of the kinship term system or not. Somebody's probably thinking about it. Anyway, the Eskimo do not actually call themselves Eskimo. That's like a French word called blubber chewer, if I remember correctly, that was imposed upon them by the French. They call themselves the Inuit. Anyway, the Eskimo system places great emphasis on the conjugal unit, the nuclear family. And it has special terms for one's own FM and your own close siblings. If you look at the chart on the left, there's Ego, which is the white triangle. It has a special name for sisters and brothers, and different names for things like your mother's sister's children, or your mother's brother's children, or your father's sister's children, or father's brother's children. You have special names for your mother and father, and then closely related names for your father's brother and your mother's brother, as well as a different name for your father's sister and your mother's sister. So outside of the nuclear family, everyone else is included into pretty fairly generic terminology, and they don't really distinguish between your MB and your FB. And the reason this should all sound familiar is because this is the Cleaver family. European kinship terminologies, and especially American kinship terminologies, belong to the Eskimo system. And if you look at that chart on the upper left, the red circle, that's mother. The blue triangle, that is father. The yellow circle, that is sister. The yellow triangle, that is brother. And your father's brother or your mother's brother, that's uncle. Your father's sister or your mother's sister, that's aunt. And then everybody in green, cousins. They're all cousins, all right? And the Eskimo system doesn't distinguish between maternal uncles and paternal uncles. It doesn't distinguish between maternal aunts and paternal aunts. It doesn't distinguish maternal or paternal cousins at all. And in fact, here is the actual one of the Inuit kinship systems right up above my head. This is what they call people in their kin structure. Father is a. I'm sure I'm completely mispronouncing these. Mother is na. All right. And you can see you've got these different kinship structures scattered around. Your mother's brother is your angak. Your father's brother is akak. And indeed, there's actually a really interesting one. If you look, the mother's birth helper, the midwife, is considered to be part of your kinship terminology. And in strict anthropological terms, that would be considered a fictive piece of kinship, but a very interesting one nonetheless. Now, the Eskimo system for Anglo-American culture has been even further simplified. You have a father, mothers, brothers, sisters, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and then just cousins. The term cousin is just kind of thrown around like crazy. The European system is a very, very simplified Eskimo kinship terminological system. But the thing is that in the past, if you go back 1,000 years, it used to be much more complicated. And we only have faint echoes of this complication, in the modern age. Cousins were once counted by distance of descent and in order of generation. People used to actually know what you meant when you said, oh, that dude over there, that's my second cousin twice removed. But most people today have only a vague echo of what that even means. And here's this chart that explains how actually counting your cousins works. Basically, first cousins have the same grandparent, which is to say everybody's parents were siblings. Second cousins have the same great-grandparent, and removal counts generational distance. So your father's brother's children are your first cousins, as your cousins. His children would be your first cousin once removed. Your first cousin's grandchildren would also be your first cousin twice removed. And your second cousin twice removed is your grandparents' siblings' great-grandchild. So the children of your great uncle is also your first cousin, but once removed, and his children are your second cousin, and their children would be your second cousin once removed. So the Anglo-American system used to have this sort of counting cousins thing built into it, and people used to know this. People would have like 20 or 30 cousins, and they knew exactly the degree of removal and the difference in generational. They would know if people used to know what third cousin twice removed actually meant. And these days, nobody really knows this, and nobody's known this for centuries. The reason for this kinship structure once served a function, and the function was to determine the amount of blood money that had to be paid if they are in fact murdered. Because Germanic society was traditionally an extremely violent society and an extremely well-armed society, as you can see from these sort of medieval drawings. And in these traditional Germanic societies, there was a system that determined the amount of blood money that had to be paid for their murder, and that was something called the varegeld. The varegeld is the blood price paid for the unlawful killing of an individual. And the price was determined on how closely related they are to the head of this big Germanic family. And every individual had their particular blood price. And the blood price depended on how closely related they were. Brothers and cousins were worth a lot of money, and the more distantly related cousins were worth less. So if I'm the head of this Germanic family that's got like 150 people in it, and I hear that a member of my family got like murdered in some barroom brawl, I'm going to go seek out this person, okay? And I'm like, you killed Roderick. And we're like, the guy's like, well, yeah, I did. I killed Roderick. And I look at this person and I go, Okay, Roderick was my second cousin twice removed, so let's consult the chart. You have to pay me this much gold. And if you don't pay me that gold, then the two families go to war. All right? In other words, varegeld served a way in which these long-term blood feuds between these heavily armed Germanic clans could in fact be avoided. All right? And in fact, if you've ever read the sort of the medieval epic Beowulf, if you've ever had that like inflicted on you, in Beowulf there's this monster called Grendel, and Grendel like eats people and he murders people in their sleep, and he's not a Christian, and he like lives in a cave in a swamp. And in Beowulf, when they list the crimes of Grendel, this horrible monster, what is his worst crime? What is one of his worst crime is not the fact that he murders people when they're sleeping. It isn't the fact that he's a freaking cannibal. It isn't the fact that he's a thief. The main crime of Grendel is that he doesn't pay the varegeld. All right? And I've kind of already answered this question for you. So why have these Germanic cultures completely abandoned this extended kinship system? You know, what would Malinowski argue? Malinowski would argue that because, these Germanic clans aren't constantly killing each other all the time anymore. In fact, these Germanic clans don't even exist anymore. And because, they're not heavily armed and they're not quick to anger and they're not going to start these blood feuds that are going to last 100 years. Well, maybe with the McCoys and the Hatfields. Well, they should have paid the varegeld. Then they wouldn't have had that horrible feud. That because nobody murders each other casually, because there's no need for a varegeld, most of this complicated extended kinship structure has simply dropped away from European culture altogether. Maybe we should have the varegeld. Maybe we should. It would be fun. Now, another type of kinship system, the Eskimo system, you understand, you know it. The Iroquois system is quite different. The Iroquois system, and those are Iroquois right there on the lower left. The Iroquois system consists of a strong emphasis on the paternal line. F and FB are referred to by the same term, as are M and MZ. So you see you have the same term for everyone in the blue triangle there on the upper left. The blue triangle marked A, you call that person father, but you also call his brothers father. If you look at the red circle marked B, you call that person mother, but you also call her sister mother. Now, it changes when you cross the gender line. You call your father's sister by something completely different. You call your mother's brother something completely different. Now, everyone in yellow gets the same term. These are all your brothers and sisters. So you call your actual biological siblings brother and sister, but you also call brother and sister your father's brother's children, your FBD and FBS. And you also call brother and sister your mother's sister's children as well, your MZD and MZS. These are all people that you refer to as, brother or sister. But again, in your parents' generation, when you cross the gender divide, the kinship structure changes. The people in green are basically just cousins, or the Iroquois equivalent of cousins. In this way, there is a strong distinction made between who is exactly in one's own lineage. The MZ and the FB and attached children, and those who are not, like the MB and the FC, they belong in other lineages. Thus, the system of kinship terminology tends to match the organization of the descent groups. And look right up above me, this is the Iroquois system itself. Your biological mother is your Naya, but her sister you also call Naya. Your father you call Haya, but his brother is also Haya. Now, your Amiwa is your biological sister, but it is also your mother's sister's daughter, and it is also your father's brother's daughters. Your Iwa is your brother, but it is also your father's brother's sons and your mother's sister's sons as well. It's everyone in yellow right up above me. And again, people in green get a different name. So once you cross sort of this gender divide, you're outside of your own immediate lineage. You have your yasiwa, which is your father's sister, and your sooya, which is your mother's brother, aunt and uncle respectively, if you want to view it in that way. And your own children, things get really interesting when you start looking at your own children. Your sons and daughters are your, I'm going to mispronounce this, ihiruya and your tiya. And you call, your son and your daughter, and you call your brother's children by the exact same thing. But again, once you cross the gender divide, you don't call your sister's children the same terms. And that's the Iroquois system. Now, Eskimo and the Iroquois systems are fairly widespread, but they're not nearly as widespread as the Hawaiian system, the most common system of kinship terminology in all of human societies across the world is the Hawaiian system. You're going to love the Hawaiian system. All students love the Hawaiian system because the Hawaiian system is the simplest and easiest kinship term system ever devised. It's incredibly simple. Basically, look there in the upper left. You can look, all the colors are coded. Your mother you call mother. Your mother's sister is your mother. Your father's sister is your mother. In fact, everyone of the older generation, all older women are called mother. Your father you call father. Your father's brother, father. Your mother's brother, father. In fact, all the people in the older generation are called father. In fact, almost all men who are older than you or about your father's age get called father. And everyone around you is your brother and sister, not just biologically. If you see there on the yellow triangle, that's your brother. But your father's brother's son, you also call brother. Your father's sister's son, brother. Mother's brother's son, brother. Mother's sister's son, brother. You use the same kinship terminology, across the entire unit. And indeed, it's casually used even outside of your own conjugal unit. All members of the same generation share the same term. Brother for all the males, sister for all the females. Basically, everyone is referred to as if they belong to the same giant family. And such systems are also generally associated with ambilineal societies. Like if you take those European noble societies, they'll casually call each other, brother and sister, regardless of how closely or distantly related they actually are. Now, if you look right up above my head, this is the actual kinship terminological system that was used in Hawaii. I'm going to try to pronounce these. And if someone hears this who is from Hawaii, you have my deepest sympathy. But basically, your mother is your makahuahine. But again, all women of your mother's generation are called makahuahine, whether they are your mother's sister or your father's sister. Your father is the makahuakane. And again, all males of your parents' generation are your makahuakane, your father's brother as well as your mother's brother. Siblings of the same generation are your kakahuahine or your kakahuaana, your sisters and brothers, regardless of if they are your own directly related biological siblings or your mother's brother's children or your mother's sister's children or your father's brother's children or your father's sister's children. You refer to everyone by the same kinship term. And indeed, going one generation lower, you use the same terms for your own children that you use for your other siblings' children, that you casually just call everyone like you're referring like the same family. So this led to a really funny and unusual instance in Hawaiian history, that in the 19th century, Episcopalian missionaries show up in Hawaii and are immediately incredibly shocked that these early Christian missionaries simply assumed that everyone in Hawaii was committing incest left and right. They'd meet someone, they're introducing themselves to the native Hawaiians. They're like, oh, this is you, John. And John goes, yes, and this is my wife, Jane. Oh, and she's also my sister. Cue the shocked missionary face on the upper left. So here is the question I'm pitching to you. Are these people really committing incest? Are these people really marrying their own sisters and brothers and fathers and mothers? Why did all of these early Christian missionaries to Hawaii accuse native Hawaiians of committing rampant incest, when in fact they are not? But why did the missionaries think they were? Now, here is a giant wall of text. I am not going to read this giant wall of text to you, but at the end of this lecture, we're actually going to do a kinship exercise, and I'm going to take this account, which is a real account, and I want you to read it, and I want you to diagram it in proper anthropological fashion. Determine, if you can, the lineality, the locality, and try to determine if these people are describing a kinship terminological system that is Eskimo, Iroquois, or Hawaiian. And you're going to do that on your own. Now, in the 1980s, during the first big surge of postmodern anthropology that we're going to talk about in the next lecture, the entire study of kinship structures came under a heavy criticism. Led by David Schneider's book, the critique basically went like this: that while there exists a virtually infinite variation of kinship arrangements, there are an infinite number of kinship arrangements, and what humans actually say their kinship structure is not necessarily what they actually do. That the people might describe these elaborate kinship rules, but they don't necessarily have to follow any of their own rules. So the postmodern critique of kinship structures and kinship studies, led by Schneider, basically argued that these kinship systems that are being devised by all of these anthropologists are basically just descriptions of idealized kinship structures that may or may not correspond with any reality. And basically the anthropologists were not documenting kinship structure. They were actually just writing down idealized forms of kinship structure and then forcing these idealized structures on these people. Anthropologists were forcing Western categories and obsession with blood relationships on native peoples. And all of this was in the process of the oppression and commoditization of non-Western peoples. So all of these kinship structures I've just spent, 2 or 3 hours describing have no real objective basis in reality, and their study is actually quite harmful to these native peoples. It's an interesting point, and it spawned some really, really fascinating research. And the research was this: can you actually objectively demonstrate the existence of a kinship structure? Can you approach this from the perspective of genetic research, from biological science, and see if these kinship structures possess any kind of objective reality? And this is what started in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. And in the early 21st century, they started to publish the results of this study, and the results were completely fascinating. And here's an article. This is from 2004. Shai in the American Journal of Human Genetics basically did genetic testing on a number of anthropological studied groups from Central Asia. And basically, these Central Asian groups were patrilineal. They said their kinship structure was patrilineal. Ergo, the expectation is that with these groups should show close genetic relationship between all of the males in the group, and slightly diminished with allied groups, and then greatly diminished with external groups. And you can see in the chart there on the lower left that the biological data perfectly matched what the anthropologists had predicted from the 1950s and 60s. All 5 of the studied groups were patrilineal and in fact showed close genetic relationship between all of the males in the group, with slightly diminished relationship with traditional marriage partners. And to the groups that they were not wife givers or wife takers with, you can see the biological distance increases and they have almost no shared genetic material. In short, this one article argued that with these groups in Central Asia, they are in fact following their own kinship rules. They are trying to meet their own idealized kinship structure. They said they are patrilineal, the studied groups were patrilineal, and the biological science supported their patrilineal organizations. Here's another article from 2009. This is King and Gobling, which was published in the Trends in Genetics article. It basically looked at genetical relationships between individuals with similar names in a patrilineal system. Again, a system where the name is handed down from father to son. And the argument is that if the names are being handed down from father to son in the expected and predicted patrilineal pattern, then there should be close genetic relationship between fathers and sons. And what they did is they found that the genetic information perfectly matched the anthropological expectation. Patrilineal men possess distinct genetic relatedness. And in the chart below, you can see the closely genetically related, the genetic relatedness of individuals with similar names. So one of the odd twists of this literature means that if you are out there in the world and you bump into somebody in an airport or a park who has your same last name and you have no idea who this is, you are probably related to that person, even though your closest relative might be 200 or 300 years back. You share you have a high likelihood of sharing genetic relationship to strangers with your own last name. And these are just 2 articles. What you have is a dozen. You have there's more than 100 articles that talk about this. That almost every single biological genetic study mapped that people in fact do follow their kinship pattern. That these idealized kinship structures recorded and documented by anthropologists are in fact supported by the objective genetic research and discovered by the genetic scientists, by the biologists who studied these groups. In short, the critique of kinship that was offered by David Schneider simply is wrong. It spawned some really great research, but the research demonstrated that people do in fact obey their own kinship structures. Kinship structures are not invented or imposed by anthropologists or by sort of Western scientists. That brings us to a close of our discussion of kinship. And what we're going to talk about in the next lecture is how you and I aren't exactly real people and none of the world exists as we know it. And I will see you there.